next presenters are Pamela Owens and Beau Schriever. Pamela has been involved in documenting the history of the Fountain Valley and southeastern Colorado since moving here 10 years ago. She works at PPLD's Fountain Library, where she teaches genealogy. She also writes the scripts for the annual cemetery tours at Fountain's Fairview Cemetery. She has worked as a contractor for the Army for the past decade, writing historic contexts that allow archaeologists to evaluate structures they may find within their place in history. Bernard grew up exploring the Pikes Peak region and its historic towns and resources. After 15 years working in the Southwest and Southern Plains, he returned home in 2010 when hired as a contract archaeologist at Fort Carson. Since then, he has conducted field work and research to help identify and evaluate the historic resources at Fort Carson and at the Pinon Canyon Maneuver Site. He also collaborates on research related to the local historic resources and is part of a research group creating an online encyclopedia of maker's marks found on bottles in the United States. Pamela and Beau.
Thank you.
And they're my favorite people, Charles and William Bent.
Good morning. Thank you for having us here. First, let me tell you a story about myth and mystery. In 1960, Charles Wesley Hurd released his self-published book entitled Bent Stockade, Hidden in the Hills, in which he claims to have found the first trading post established by the Bent brothers in Colorado in 1826. Wow. Now, evidence was sketchy at best, but as Hurd wrote in his book,
The dearth of dependable information on many matters connected with Western history has left the field wide open for writers to give their imagination full freedom for the creation of tales that please them best.
the site we're going to talk about today was visited by University of Denver professional archaeologist Arnold Withers in 1963, and he denied Hurd's claim based on lack of any physical evidence. But once in print, Mr. Hurd's book, The Myth Persisted, possibly because the reader was drawn in by the emotional strength of his story, and the reader wanted to believe him. And that still happens today. Though the site Hurd described was not Bent Stockade, the place is fascinating in its own right. For a little background history, according to Wikipedia, and since it's in print, it must be true, right? The Bent brothers came out in about 1826 to trap, went back to St. Louis each year to get supplies. They set up 2 stockades, one possibly in the Pueblo area, the other where the Purgatory River and the Arkansas River come together. Neither stockade has ever been found. In about 1833, William and Charles Bent built a trading post along the Arkansas River where the Indians would come together and have their rendezvous and camps where traders met. And this is known as Bent's Fort today. It was recreated by the Park Service. And then this fort was either blown up or left, or you can argue about that forever. But in about 1849, William Bent built another fort farther downriver.
Not all scholars agree that the Bents built the stockade in 1826 or were even in Colorado at that time. The source of the information that the Bents were here in 1826 appears to originate with C.W. Bowman's History of Bent County, published in 1881. It seems that authors following on Bowman just simply accepted and echoed his information, and perhaps this is where Hurd got the inspiration for his tale. This map was created in 1910 by George Hyde through correspondence with George Bent, William Bent's son. It shows the location, or a location, of the stockade. Perhaps by talking with someone closer to the source, the truth would be revealed. Unfortunately, George Bent's memory must have been a little rusty because he gave Mr. Hyde at least 2 locations for the stockade. The one shown here on the map is about 15 to 20 miles west of Pueblo, near where either Turkey Creek or Beaver Creek enters the Arkansas. In other correspondence, George Bent indicated that the stockade was located at the confluence of Fountain Creek in the Arkansas River in modern-day Pueblo. Perhaps George was confused and confusing the Bent stockade with either Pikes 1806 breastwork put up in Pueblo or Jacob Fowler's 1822 stockade also put up in Pueblo. To confuse the matters more, Dr. Nole Mummy, a historian from Denver, wrote a book on forts and trading posts in the West. Looking through Bent's the personal papers, letters, and other documents related to the Bents, he could find no evidence that the Bents were in Colorado before 1832. And interestingly, the history of Pueblo County, written by R.M. Stevenson in 1881, published alongside Bowman's work, makes no mention of a stockade in Pueblo County. Certainly, the people in Pueblo would have known at that time whether or not the Bents had built a stockade in their county. Maybe it didn't exist.
C.W. Hurd was an amateur historian. He was born in Canada in 1876, and his parents came to Colorado in 1880. So Hurd spent most of his life on the plains.
Hurd here, since around 1910, I've come to know the land between Pueblo and Canyon City through my work with the railroad. Later, I became interested in the region's early history, particularly that of the Bent brothers and their exploits. It seemed to me that through time, fanciful tales were replacing the early history of the region, and there was a need to find and record that history before it was lost forever. For this reason, I began to study the Bent brothers, and particularly their first stockade. No one seemed to know where it was, or even seemed to care. For many years, I searched for it along the banks of the Arkansas River, but eventually I had to give up. My conclusion was that what the historians had written was true. The stockade had been along the north banks of the Arkansas River, and time and floods had erased all evidence of it. At least that's what I thought, until I received a letter.
Hi, my name's Gertrude McLeod. My husband and I live in Penrose. Now, sometime in the late 40s, Dewey and I were out, there I am. We're out walking the hills south of Camp Carson, and we were looking for pretty rocks and Indian artifacts, that's what you did back then. And we saw these posts sticking up out of the ground, kind of like that picture, and I didn't know what they were. And so I asked around other folks that had been out there, and they didn't know. They just said they were as old as dirt, but they didn't know what they were. And so a few years later, I heard about this man who was looking for posts, and I wrote him a letter, and he got really excited, so we finally took him out to the site.
And there it was, just what I had been looking for. There were rows of stumps, the remains of the stockade walls, and there were the remains of 3 buildings. That was all that was left for the Bent's first trading post. It was just as I expected it to be. I was so excited I wrote a book about the place and gave a few talks. The newspapers loved it, and later writers referenced my work, ensuring my place in history forever. There are many possible reasons that a stockade could be built around a site. For defense, to control livestock, or to protect belongings. In what follows, we discuss the archaeological evidence, the archival data, and the landscape setting of the site that all refute that this site was the location of Bent's 1826 stockade, as Hurd suggested. With respect to the archaeological data, the site has been visited numerous times by professional archaeologists, and none of them have ever found any evidence that suggests the site is older than the 1870s. Archaeologists study humanity's past through the remains that survive to the present. Things such as buildings, foundations, trash, and even burials. One key or important thing to being able to understand the past is being able to tell how old things are. So archaeologists have invested a lot of time in studying the changes in material items that people use through time, such as these Coke bottles. I hope you notice that there's differences in styles and technology represented in that graphic there. This slide shows some of the datable material that has been recovered at the site, nails and cartridge cases. Archaeologists have used items such as ceramics, the color and shape of bottles, the thickness of window glass, the head stamps and sizes of cartridge cases, and the manufacturing technology of nails and cans found at the site to date it. Other items, like this 1878 Morgan silver dollar, speak for itself. And the bottle base up in the upper left-hand corner like the one down below, which is a more recent, or I mean not a recent, it's a example of one that wasn't found on a site, bears the maker's mark of a glass factory, the Chase Valley Glass Factory out of Wisconsin, that only produced bottles for 1 year in 1880 to 1881. When Withers visited the site in 1963, he noted that the main structure, probably the residence, was built of masonry with concrete mortar. Concrete would have been available in Colorado in 1870s, primarily in urban areas, and it would not have been available in 1826 when Colorado was still a frontier.
Like Beau noted, nothing has been found on the site that dates before about 1870, but the site is old, and the archival evidence shows the same thing. I've looked at early maps of the area, the first Homestead patent, newspaper articles, county histories, and as seen on this map, the township was actually surveyed by Titus Wetmore in 1873, and the map was produced in 1874. This is very early in Colorado history. So before then, this is how we got public land, as they surveyed it. Mr. Wetmore drew in wagon roads, Indian trails, rock outcrops. He put in a lot of detail. And he even drew in the house and the corral of a Mr. Andrews, right where the site happens to be. Land patents show that in May 1877, DeForest Andrews filed a claim on 160 acres of land that included the homestead here. And the line across is actually a survey quarter section, and Mr. Wetmore described walking through the corral when he surveyed this. It was here. He was on the site. But Mr. Andrews didn't homestead here. So he filed on it in 1877, and at the end of his 7 years, when he had to do something, where he was going to lose the land, he used a cash claim and paid cash for the property, and then promptly sold it to the Reynolds Cattle Company. Andrews. Well, he was born in New York in 1841, and his parents moved to the frontier of Illinois as a child. Then he heard about the gold rush in Colorado and came west and took up mining. He was so famous he had his own biography, and it says that in 1859, at the old age of 18, he founded the town of Nevadaville near Central City. He served as mayor of that town. He went on to serve in the Colorado State Legislature. He served with the 3rd Colorado Cavalry during the Civil War. In the late 1880s, he sold his mining interest in Colorado for $85,000 and moved to Boise, Idaho, where he bought up considerable land, served as a legislator there, was nominated for governor, although he was defeated, and he died in Boise in 1903. But of local interest, Mr. DeForest Andrews and John Sullivan were mining partners in Nevadaville, and although they broke up that alliance in 1870, they had a different alliance. They owned the Falls Cattle Ranch on Turkey Creek in Pueblo County, and the articles here show they were trying to sell 5 ranches, although they didn't own title yet. It hadn't been surveyed. An 1871 newspaper article says they were already delinquent on their taxes and were going to lose the land, but they didn't own it, so maybe they were leasing it from the government. I don't know. In testimony given by Mrs. Isabella Andrews after her husband's death, she stated that they and the Sullivan brothers took turns living on this ranch in Pueblo County 1 year each, and the other time they spent living in the mountains and mining. Thus, archival data shows that the structure was associated with an active cattle ranch from about 1870, and it remained in the ranching area until this land was made part of Fort Carson in 1965. The stockade wall noted by Hurd around the site wasn't there in 1873, and when Withers surveyed the site in 1963, he said the locals told him there used to be posts around this, but when the homesteaders moved in the 20s and 30s, they took some of the posts and used them on their own property.
The stockade shown on Hyde's 1910 map was not found when the township that would have contained it west of Pueblo, shown here on this map, was surveyed in the 1870s. The surveyor recounted that the land within the township was dry and hilly, with only a few meager farms along the Arkansas River bottomland. No stockade. Regarding the cultural landscape, the site was not built in a defensible location, and no stockade or fence would have protected it from attack. It is located at the base of a hill along Turkey Creek, surrounded by higher land to the north and west. This photo shows looking down from the hilltop to the north on the site, which is where the trees are. This next photo is a view from the site looking west across Turkey Creek to the towering cliffs on the other side. Defense would have been an important consideration of the Bents in 1826, as Colorado was still a wild frontier. And other considerations would have also come into play. The site is 15 miles north of the Arkansas River, a major travel corridor of the time. And the Arkansas River would have been a permanent water source with marshes for animals and pretty much people going by on it. So it would have been a better location to place to settle for trapping and also to conduct trade. So if the stockade on this site was not a defensive, for defensive purposes, why was it built? It could have been built to keep animals out of the Homestead area, keep animals in. Such fences are common on contemporary ranches of the area and in New Mexico, where they're called coyote fences. But an alternative hypothesis was proposed in 1987 by archaeologist Christian Zier. He believed the Andrews Homestead was reused around 1908 as a grading camp for crews from the Kansas-Colorado Railroad who were building a line to the quarries in the area. He noted that the railroad initially intended a line up Turkey Creek that would have passed by the homestead, and that's the dotted line within the circle in the upper left-hand corner. Down here from Pumpkin Hollow, there's a line going west and then north up Booth Gulch to where Stone City is located. As support, Zier showed this picture, which he identified as a grading camp in Booth Gulch near Stone City. Note the stockade built around the tent and the equipment and horses both in and around it. We find that Zier's hypothesis is compelling, but that he misidentified the function of the camp. Brad Bowers, a historian from Pueblo, who has studied Stone City and the railroad, identified this very same photo as a freighting camp used by the clay and mining companies that were operating in Stone City beginning around 1906. And given that stone and clay mining were also occurring on Turkey Creek near the Andrews Homestead about the same time, we find it compelling that perhaps a stockade around the Andrews Homestead was set up at that time also to serve as a freighting camp. Just as at construction sites today, equipment is fenced in order to keep it from disappearing.
Some things don't change. The data presented here today clearly refutes Hurd's claim that this is the site of Bent's first stockade. Rather, the site was the homestead of DeForest Andrews, who engaged in mining and some ranching for several decades in Colorado before moving to Idaho. We have no evidence to add to the hypothesis that the Bents even had a stockade in Pueblo County. And lastly, we would like to suggest that while Hurd's book is an interesting read and emotionally compelling, the library district should relegate it to the realm of historical fiction. Thank you.
I think we have a new myth in the making. Not only were the Bent brothers fur trappers and fur traders, they were Coca-Cola distributors. Our final presenter in this session is Beau Driver. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. His research interests lie in labor and working class intellectual and cultural history. Driver focuses on the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era in the United States and is currently working on his dissertation, which examines the life and work of Walter Wyckoff, professor of economics and sociology at Princeton University and the author of The Workers, An Experiment in Reality. Beau.
Thank you. Just as a note of preface, I read this to my wife last night, and she said I should say something about what a Chautauqua is, because I'm going to be talking about the Chautauqua and Garden of the Gods. And the Chautauqua movement endeavored to bring education and entertainment to people who wouldn't otherwise really have access to higher education and things of that nature, as well as bringing in music and some cultural activities as well. So, thank you. Just west of us here today sits the Garden of the Gods, nestled against the Front Range. This set of impressive formations of red, sand, and limestone have been a staple of spiritual and cultural life in our region since before the European settlement in the area in the 1850s. From the time that the city of Colorado Springs was founded, the Garden of the Gods drew many tourists as they came to visit this area because of its proximity to Pikes Peak and the healing waters of Manitou Springs. It is not surprising then that the rock formations have served as a symbol for a variety of endeavors throughout the history of our city, nor is it surprising that local leaders looking to set up an independent Chautauqua in the Pikes Peak region at the turn of the 20th century chose the Garden of the Gods as the location of their assembly. The purpose of this discussion is to examine four different presenters: Frederick Jackson Turner, Walter Wyckoff, Jonathan Prentice Dolliver, and John Wallace, or Captain Jack Crawford, at the Garden of the Gods Chautauquan Assembly and Summer School. And I hope to show how an early form of mass culture, that of the Chautauqua, was presented to the attendees of these programs, and show that it helped to further hegemonic conceptions of the American West and in the United States more generally that were created in the minds of these men of the East and then communicated to the people of Colorado Springs. In 1902, the Garden of the Gods Chautauqua opened for the first time. Located in the shadows of Pikes Peak and the Rocky Mountains, the assembly promised to bring entertainment and culture to Colorado Springs. The Chautauqua movement had swept through the United States since the founding of the Mother Chautauqua in 1874, and that was in New York. And by the time that the Garden of the Gods Assembly opened 28 years later, it seemed that any city that wanted to make a name for itself as a space for culture and spirituality had a Chautauqua of its own. Many of us, I hope, are familiar with the Chautauqua in Boulder. However, the administrators of the Colorado Springs, and most notably at the time Mayor Robinson, not to be outdone by her neighbors to the north, decided to move forward and create an independent Chautauqua after losing a bid to host what was then called the Texas-Colorado Chautauqua that would later be built in Boulder. At its founding, William Jackson Palmer saw the city of Colorado Springs as a European city on the frontier. And like many other cities across the country, Colorado Springs saw the value in creating an event that can offer entertainment and culture to its population while also creating an opportunity to capture revenue from the tourists and travelers that assembly would attract. The city also benefited from the location of the Colorado College, Pikes Peak, Manitou Springs, and all of which existed within short distances from the proposed Chautauqua grounds, and all of which also maintain a romantic attraction to those traveling from the east. The Chautauqua grounds was actually on the kind of south-west side of Garden of the Gods, right about where you would get out onto Manitou Avenue now, I guess. Colorado College was in fact instrumental in the creation and promotion of the Garden of the Gods Chautauqua. Established in 1874, Colorado College had begun to conduct summer school sessions, much in the vein of the Chautauquas themselves, in 1892. The temperate climate, combined with spacious vistas and the healing powers of the dry mountain air and the mineral springs in Manitou, helped to create a very appealing venue for academics on break for the summer. Many prestigious academics came to teach in the first decade of the Colorado College Summer School, including Catherine Lee Bates, who wrote the words to America the Beautiful, as many of us know, while visiting for a summer school session in 1893. Woodrow Wilson, who was then just a historian at Princeton, and he visited in 1895, and the prominent philosopher William James of Harvard, who's often now called the father of American psychology, who visited in 1897. The growing prestige of Colorado College continued to attract prominent lecturers to the West for a few weeks sojourn in the mountains. However, by 1902, the faculty of the college had grown, and its rising academic reputation began to decrease the need to import educators for its programs. Additionally, the cost of travel associated with bringing these academics into the town was beginning to become more prohibitive. Because of this, the Colorado College Summer School began to draw its instructors from its own faculty in the years following 1902. So this would be essentially the last year they imported people from the East. For officials of the Garden of the Gods Chautauqua, Colorado College's change to the use of its own faculty created an opportunity to continue the tradition of bringing prestigious academics to the area for the summer, albeit in a new and more public venue. The close relationship between the Colorado College Summer School and the inaugural session of the Garden of the Gods Chautauqua is easily seen in the newspaper notices of the Colorado Springs Gazette, which scarcely differentiate between the two in the lead up to the summer activities. In many cases, the use of the word Chautauqua and of the term summer school work interchangeably. In fact, readers must have mentioned the confusion because in several instances the publishers felt it necessary to attempt to clarify the distinction between the two. In a short article in the August 5th, 1902 edition of the Gazette, the writer states, quote, "As there may be some confusion regarding the matter in the public mind, it may be well to mention that the summer school known session includes those courses for which regular classrooms are a necessity, while lectures, concerts, and entertainments are to be held in the auditorium of the Chautauqua grounds," end quote. Even here, the distinction is minimal. The article fails to mention that the lectures of the summer school at the Colorado College were held largely during mornings and afternoons, while those of the Chautauqua grounds were held in the evenings for the most part, in an attempt to include those who spent their days working. From July 23rd to the middle of August, Colorado College opened its doors to teachers and other academics from the region. The college offered courses in history, political economy, geology, music, and pedagogy, among others. These courses were meant more often than not for more serious academics and what we might now call hardcore enthusiasts, many like yourselves, I imagine. For these well-educated middle-class folk, the classes offered instruction that prominent academics brought from their colleges and universities in the East, and instruction that those living in the quickly expanding West could not hope to attend without significant investment in time and money. However, because many of the prominent citizens of Colorado Springs were recent arrivals who still maintained their connections to their former homes in the East, it was not out of the realm of possibility that they might have the opportunity to travel for their education. And in this way, the classes taught at the Colorado College, perhaps with the exception of those that were intended specifically for the instruction of teachers, were instructing a homogeneous group of people who were more likely than not already acquainted with the ideas in the courses and even the teachers presenting them. For the general public, though, the Garden of the Gods Chautauqua opened on August 6, 1902. The program consists of many of the hallmarks of other assemblies: music, oration, and education. Among the dignitaries that gave lectures at the inaugural Chautauqua were Frederick Jackson Turner, Senator Dolliver of Iowa, John Wallace, or Captain Jack Crawford, who is also kind of known as the Poet Scout, and most prominently at the time, Walter Wyckoff, a sociologist from Princeton University, who had become well known for his books on the working class, The Workers, An Experiment in Reality, presented in 2 volumes, and a number of different articles that he wrote for Scribner's Monthly magazine. Frederick Jackson Turner traveled to Colorado Springs at the end of the summer session from the University of Wisconsin. Turner had agreed to teach 2 series of 8 lectures apiece at the Colorado College Summer School. However, in a move to poach the talent of the Colorado College and to utilize those academic connections, the administrators of the newly combined Chautauqua and Summer School impressed upon Turner to teach 2 additional lectures to the public at the Chautauqua grounds. The two series of lectures that Turner delivered to the students of the summer school ran back-to-back in the mornings, beginning at 10:30 for the first one and 11:30 for the second. The first series was on the influence of the West upon the nation, which was what Turner was predominantly famous for, while the second series was on methods of teaching history. The two lectures that Turner presented at the Garden of the Gods, Chautauqua, were titled Andrew Jackson, simply, and The Diplomatic Prelude to the Louisiana Purchase. All of these lectures contained elements that would help to create a normative ideology of the West, but also of the history of the United States in a more general way. In fact, Turner agreed to talk at the Chautauqua grounds. The fact that Turner agreed to talk at the Chautauqua grounds was a boon for the Assembly. The Gazette reported, quote, "The management of the Chautauqua is extremely fortunate in securing Professor Turner, for it is a well-known fact that he declines each year numerous flattering offers to lecture before similar assemblies throughout the country," end quote. The paper also alluded to Turner's prowess as an orator. Quote, "The subjects that Professor Turner will discuss are not dry historical data and dates, but live social and political problems in which even the average laborer will be intensely interested," end quote. Much emphasis seems to have been added to the fact that Turner was known to be an engaging orator, and through his lectures, even the most educated laborer could find value. For Turner, the excursion to Colorado Springs did not bear the financial benefits that he had expected. His series at the Colorado College was Turner's first opportunity to lecture at the summer school in the summer school circuit, and lured by the promise of the Rocky Mountains in the summer, as well as opportunities for camping and fishing, and the health benefits of the thin Colorado air, Turner agreed to deliver lectures to the summer school. It was not until he arrived, however, that Turner found himself pressured into delivering the 2 additional lectures. To add insult to injury, the promise of pay of $100 was reduced, and Turner only actually received $50 total for the morning lecture series and the public lectures. And additionally, the Turners were instructed to take certain railways to get to Colorado Springs. He was really incensed about this in some of his letters, and felt it to be a great inconvenience. Regardless of the inconveniences, Turner enjoyed an opportunity to get away from the University of Wisconsin, and lecturing on the summer school circuit became a regular occurrence in his life after his time in Colorado Springs during the summer of 1902. However, he did never, as far as I can see, return to Colorado Springs. Another of the Colorado College's summer school faculty that found himself doing double duty was a professor of political economy and sociology from Princeton University, Walter Wyckoff, who's my favorite because I'm writing my dissertation about him. Today, Wyckoff has nearly been forgotten by history. However, during the summer of 1902, he was an academic superstar and by far the biggest draw to the summer school. This is a fact that can be plainly seen by the sheer amount of attention that Wyckoff receives in the local newspaper. Multiple editions, including the Gazette, the Evening Gazette, and the Weekly Gazette, all kept the people of Colorado Springs well aware of the movements of this academic as he stayed in town. Wyckoff's arrival in Colorado Springs even warranted a special section in that day's Evening Gazette, a fact that was not duplicated for any of the other faculty or dignitaries that came for the summer school and assembly. Further, when Wyckoff subsequently decided to spend a year in Colorado after the summer school, the Gazette took the time to interview him continuously on various subjects, both local and national, until he left the Springs at the end of the year. Interestingly, he met his wife while he was here, and so he ended up staying with her. They were married in the summer of 1903. She was part of the Eric family, which was very prominent in Colorado Springs at the time. Like Turner, Wyckoff was engaged to give a series of lectures to the students of the summer school. In contrast, however, the administrators of the summer school scheduled Wyckoff in the evening at 8:15 and held his lectures in Colorado College's Perkins Hall. This was arranged specifically to enable the largest number of people from the community to attend his lectures on economics and industrialism, another signal of his academic chops in the minds of the organizers. Also, like Turner, Wyckoff was convinced to give a lecture at the Chautauqua grounds to the general public. For this lecture, Wyckoff gave a talk on the time he spent as a laborer working his way across the United States some 10 years earlier. And this was probably of great interest to locals who attended, as he had worked through Colorado Springs and up into Cripple Creek in late 1892 and early 1893, almost exactly a decade before. And this is actually what he had become famous for, was this travel as a working person. So Wyckoff's lectures all involved the state of the working class in the United States to varying degrees. The lectures given to those at the Colorado College had titles such as Exchange, Capital as a Means of Production, and the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, the records at the summer school at the Colorado College are relatively sparse, and the content of Wyckoff's actual lectures is hard to determine. However, from his books and articles, and from testimony given in 1900 to a subcommittee of the United States Congress, we can infer what his ideas were on the working class. Wyckoff seemed to hold that there was plenty of work in the United States for anyone who looked in the right places. His experiences in cities such as Chicago had led him to believe that while work in urban areas was scarce, it was easy to find employment in rural areas. In fact, Wyckoff seemed to subscribe to the romance of the yeoman farmer that many now associate with Thomas Jefferson. In his testimony, Wyckoff explains that working as a farm laborer might be the most effective way of creating Americans from the immigrant classes that were coming into the United States. He states, quote, "I think that a man of such character that he can be taken in it is of the very first importance to him as a matter of social training and as a matter of training for citizenship, because there is no class among whom he can learn American institutions as he can among our farming classes. Men who themselves are intelligent, observant, and who know American institutions and believe in them." End quote. Again, we see the ways that Wyckoff's ideas on the American working class could, like Turner's on the West, help to create a very normative notion of what constituted an American, as well as what kind of work created the most intelligent and pious men. The final two speakers that I'll go over here appeared only at the Chautauqua grounds and did not give academic classes at Colorado College, but are just as important in the way that they created a narrative of the West and of the United States. John Prentice Dolliver, the Republican senator from Iowa, who had been rumored to be a vice presidential candidate under McKinley before Theodore Roosevelt stepped up, and he was a well-known orator as well, came to give 2 lectures on the United States and its exceptionalism. The Gazette advised readers on the following day that Dolliver's first discussion, and this is in all caps, quote, "rang loud with patriotism." Much of the text of Dolliver's lecture appears in the newspaper, and in the talk he makes many mentions of the United States as a world power, and also makes sweeping statements such as, quote, "every American should take pride in having his country, a country that protects the downtrodden everywhere, his flag, a flag that stands for liberty from one end of the world to the other," end quote. His statements reflect Dolliver's steadfast belief in the mission of American imperialism in the West, which many of the other speakers have touched on here, and indeed throughout the globe as an extension of God's divine will. This gave those assembled a further sense of their part in the great divine experiment that was the United States. Finally, John Walker, Captain Jack Crawford, the Poet Scout, arrived in Colorado Springs as part of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show in the first few days of August of 1902. It appears that after a couple of successful shows, Crawford agreed to give a special talk for the Chautauqua. The Gazette did not publish a recount of Crawford's discussion, but it's easy to imagine that the Poet Scout related tales of his involvement in the fight against Native Americans across the West. On the day of Crawford's talk, a description of his credentials as a veteran of many engagements over the preceding 3 decades appeared. The notice for his speech notes, quote, "Captain Jack is a rare character. He is a man of rough experience, but of much culture in his personality. His entertainment, consisting largely of readings of his own poems and writings on the frontier subjects, are quite well known. His cowboy sermons are spoken of most favorably by those who have heard them," end quote. As with the other major speakers at the Chautauqua Assembly, it's apparent that Crawford's anecdotes and cowboy sermons were sure to titillate the attendees while simultaneously presenting a very particular narrative about the nature of the American frontier. Through this paper, I have hoped to show the ways that the ideas of various orators and intellectuals helped to create a vision of the life on the frontier and the history of the American West that could be easily understood by the residents of Colorado Springs, those actually living in the West. And for those in the administration of the town, it was becoming more and more important to create that image of a great and thoughtful town on the cusp of the frontier, a bastion of culture and civility in the midst of the rough and tumble American West. Through Frederick Jackson Turner's lectures on the history of the West, working in concert with the tales of Captain Jack Crawford, people living at the foot of the Continental Divide were told how they fit into the story of American history. while Walter Wyckoff's ideas about the state of the worker in the United States, combined with Senator Dolliver's fervent assertions of the greatness of the United States and her place in God's divine plan, helped to sell not only American imperialism overseas, but the divine providence of westward expansion that had happened previously. And through these events, a great new form of mass culture reassured the people of their unassailable correctness as citizens of the United States living in the great western expanses of the country. Thank you.
We have 6 minutes and 22 seconds for questions. And as our, I'm going to get you. As our presenters come up, a couple of housekeeping items. Up. Gotta move this crowd along. A couple of housekeeping items. One, Tim's reminded me that there is a Symposium bookstore as you go out. It's at the end of the hall to your left, and many of our presenters today have books for sale there. The second thing, when we do break, the signal for coming back, of course, is. And that way we can just disperse immediately. A couple of ground rules as far as questions are concerned. First of all, keep your questions short. If you start to ramble, I will go like this, and I will say, do you have a point? Okay, I've done it. Second, I will repeat the questions before directing it to the presenter that you're asking it of, because of our audience, worldwide audience for this history symposium. It comes across clear. So I'll entertain some questions. Yes.
Yes, question from Beau Driver. Beau, was the United Chautauqua a one-year event only? Was there any leftovers to 1903 or beyond?
The question is, were there any Chautauquas in Colorado Springs after the 1902 Chautauqua? And if you use that microphone, please.
There were. The independent Chautauqua here in Colorado Springs lasted roughly to about 1907. This first one was the grandest, I think, from what I've seen. But by 1907, a group called the Red Path Chautauqua really took over, and a lot of the independent Chautauquas folded in favor of this one that really kind of traveled around like a carnival in a sense, that went from town to town to town and gave its presentations.
Yes, sir.
Yes, this question is for Catherine Sturman. Hi, ma'am. With regard to the Great American Desert, I had a question about the rain following the plow, and the question is this: is there any meteorological or climate research to indicate that when Lieutenant Pike and Major Long came through, it was an atypically dry period in the climate versus that period right after the 1890 drought where it was atypically wet and lulled all those people from the 1909 Homestead Act extension into coming into the region and believing that this was going to be a great place to farm.
The
Okay.
question, Kathy, the question is...
You need to repeat that?
Huh?
This is a former student of mine, by the way, who is now a teacher. Right?
Yeah, I am going to repeat it. The question is, when Pike came through and when Long came through, maybe it was a desert, okay? Was it or not?
I actually haven't seen research specifically on connecting the conditions when Pike and Long came through. I'll look for it because I think you're making an excellent point. It's very cyclical, and clearly it was probably a dry spell then. It certainly was, as you're saying, a wet spell during not even a whole decade before the 1890s drought, and that helped people call that the region that we call the Upper Plains or the Central Plains the rain belt. It wasn't just that they thought maybe it'll come, it's that there was enough there to do dry farming. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're right, if there was such a cycle, but I don't know if anyone has pinned that down scientifically.
Kathy,
And thanks for being here.
Walter Prescott Webb's book, long ago. Is it
Great West.
What?
Or the Great Plains, the Great West, he wrote several.
The Great Plains. He talks a lot about how rain,
Yes.
for over a 400-mile a span would retreat to the east and then come to the west based on sunspots. I don't know if that's meteorologically sound or not, but it's a fun book to read.
But he got in a lot of trouble. A lot of historians got in trouble over being realistic about the weather of the plains and the lack of water. No one wanted to hear it.
Well, I'm just referencing books I read when I was a kid. Okay?
They're still important books, Mike.
Yes, ma'am.
In your presentation, you said that the Albert Rebellion was in October of 47, and this was, it was in January of 47. So
Okay, maybe there was a misprint on my my slide. Was there, Nancy? It's my wife's fault. She proofread them. Okay. There was a rumor in October of 1846 that there was going to be revolt, but it didn't occur, so it was January of 1847. Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Pam and Bernard. If I go visit Bent's Fort now, is that really Bent's Fort?
Okay, is Bent's Fort really Bent's Fort?
Are you talking about Bent's Fort in La Junta, Los Animas?
I don't know.
Yeah.
The site we talked about is actually on Fort Carson.
Understand, yeah.
Yeah. It's not Bent Stockade.
Understand that. Is that the actual site, and how much of the fort, the Bent's Fort, is actually reconstructed?
All of it's reconstructed.
Well,
Every bit.
is the location accurate?
No.
Like the four corners?
No, but just pretend, okay? I used to take students along the Santa Fe. Is that a rut? I said, if it makes your day, it's a rut. It's time for a break, and we'll come back and talk to you.